Hey peeps, today we're talking about bullshit. Maybe some of you brave keyboard warriors think that everything I cover on my channel is already bullshit. And to those of you who think that, you're absolutely correct. In all seriousness, I'm excited to share an in-person discussion I moderated between Professors Gideon Rosen, Liz Harman, and Jaime Fernandez Fisac. The event was hosted by Princeton University Press, who recently published a beautiful anniversary edition of Harry Frankfurt's little... I'm holding this upside down, aren't I? They recently published a beautiful anniversary edition of Harry Frankfurt's excellent little book on bullshit. It's so beautiful, look at that. Look at it! Bullshit is a greater enemy of the truth than lies are. Wow. And I know what you're thinking. No, they didn't pay me to promote this. I'm not that much of a grifter, though definitely check out my Patreon in the description. Anyway, I put a link to buy the book in the description, along with a link to Princeton University Press's channel and the original live stream on its channel, which they've kindly allowed me to re-upload. I'm very grateful for that, and also for their invitation to moderate the event. In that original video is included nice introductions for the panelists and for Princeton University Press and various other things, but for us and my channel, we're just going to delve right into the conversation.
I'm very excited for tonight because we had some conversations about On Bullshit via email and Zoom, and we covered some genuinely new and interesting terrain. So if we can even get 1/10 of that magic here tonight, I think this will be great. So I guess we should probably start off by asking, do you guys remember the first time you encountered Harry Frankfurt's On Bullshit? And if so, what kind of made it stick out to you guys?
I remember when I saw it as a graduate student when I was around your age. So On Bullshit originally appeared in a literary journal. And I don't know that anyone saw it there. And then it was republished in a collection of Harry's papers called On the Importance of What We Care About. And that collection was a landmark collection. It did quite a lot to consolidate Harry's status as one of the great philosophers of the 20th century. It includes one sort of philosophical masterpiece after another. And then there's On Bullshit, right in the middle of these classic philosophy papers, and it really sticks out there. You read the title page, and it's obviously not like the others. And I read it there, and I remember thinking that it was a kind of brilliant joke. My view of it's changed quite a lot, but I took it to be a sort of half-serious send-up of conceptual analysis of the sort that philosophers do. And I thought it was brilliant. I didn't think very hard about it until I grew up and the culture changed and bullshit became more salient to me than it had been before.
I have a bit of a similar story in that I remember encountering the essay and just thinking that it was fun. It was sort of transgressive to be talking about bullshit, but interesting, not a topic that there was already a lot of work on. And then a friend of mine who's now my colleague in the philosophy department at Princeton University, Sarah McGrath, and we gave a talk about Harry Frankfurt's On Bullshit as a keynote at a student conference. We thought for these undergrad students, that would be a fun topic. And this is a talk that we gave 20 years ago. And then we never went on and tried to publish our thoughts or anything. It just had this life as this talk. And I was looking back at what we said in the talk, and I realized that we weren't convinced that Harry was really onto something. And now, in the moment we're in now, I just have such a different take than I had then 20 years ago.
So I also encountered On Bullshit as a student. It was first recommended to me by a professor back in my undergraduate years when I was a student in Madrid. And being terribly irresponsible student as I was at the time, I did not read it right away. I actually kept it sort of as a to-do item that, at some point I'll get down to, until I was in my graduate school years already in the US. And I was starting to think a lot about human robot interaction and human AI interaction. And, if we want to be able to get these machines and complex systems to understand how to interact with people, that we better be able to encode into them some notion of how people interact, how they communicate, and so on. So, I finally got around to sitting down and reading the book or the essay, which, to my shame, I did in one sitting because it's not very long, and what it is extremely entertaining. So you can just read the whole thing, and it's over before you know it. I don't think I've stopped thinking about on bullshit ever since, because it is, as I'm sure we're going to discuss, something that is so prevalent in a lot of our everyday human interactions, but also so increasingly relevant as we think about the way in which we interact with technology. And that's something that I've been dedicating a lot of my time and a lot of my thought to. We'll get to talk a little bit more about that, but I think it's Frankfurt's bullshit concept has been stuck in my head for the better part of the last 10 to 15 years.
Well, maybe we can, before we get into some of the applications and also defining bullshit, we haven't quite done that yet. We will get to that. Let's say something about who Harry Frankfurt was, the man, the philosopher, the myth, the legend. So maybe we can start with Liz, because I know Liz has some fun personal anecdotes about this. So Liz, how about you take it away?
Well, the stories that I want to tell are about the fact that when I got married 17 years ago, Harry Frankfurt officiated my wedding. And, Harry, one of his topics that he wrote important philosophical work on was love. So who better to have officiate your wedding? And one part of having him officiate was planning the ceremony with him, and we ended up having to negotiate what would be said during the ceremony because Harry wasn't legally marrying us. We were going to get legally married down at town hall with the mayor a few days before the wedding, but we weren't going to make a big deal of that to anybody at the wedding. And so Harry didn't want to say at the crucial moment at the end of the ceremony, he didn't want to say, I now pronounce you husband and wife. He felt that would be totally inappropriate and dishonest, right? Because he wasn't in a position to pronounce us anything. He wasn't the right kind of, he didn't have the status to pronounce us. So honesty was important. And so we had to have this interesting negotiation of what was he willing to say. And then what we ended up deciding is that at the end of the ceremony, he felt comfortable saying, congratulations, you're married. with great joy, and it was lovely. And of course it was true, right? Because by that point we were married. So that was a really lovely part. Working that out with Harry was really lovely. And then another thing that was lovely was the speech that he gave. And he was very clear that he would keep his speech a secret. And we would not know until the day of the wedding what he said. So we were standing there and he gave this speech. And he said, Harry Frankfurt, the great theorist of love, he said, romantic love, here's what romantic love is like. It conceals the flaws of the other, of the beloved. It hides the faults of your beloved. Here's what marriage is like. Marriage reveals the flaws of the other. And he said, but then, another great thing about marriage is it's really hard to exit. And that was really great. And that was exactly what we wanted, a real serious talk about marriage. And then after it was over, my colleague, Kim Shapley, who's a sociologist, said, that was the most theorized wedding I've ever been to. And then my colleague, Delia Graf-Farah, said, there should have been a Q&A because I have an objection. Contrary to what Harry said, love and marriage are compatible.
Gideon, you actually taught some classes with Harry, right?
I'll just say a little bit about what Harry stood for in philosophy. Harry began his career as a historian of philosophy. He wrote a fantastic book on Descartes, and then switched gears. He was always a card-carrying analytic philosopher, the sort of philosopher who knows what it is to speak clearly, who values clarity and precision and rigor. And the knock on analytic philosophy had always been that the tools are fantastic but totally useless for any human purpose, because the things we care about are resistant to that kind of hard-edged analysis. And what Harry stands for is the marriage of that kind of analytic rigor with a focus on topics of real human concern. So Harry's papers, the ones in the book that I mentioned earlier, The Importance of What We Care About, turned the traditional free will problem, a problem that had existed for millennia, on its head by pointing out a fact that almost all of the discussion had completely missed. The focus is on whether it's possible to have free will in a deterministic world, because free will requires the ability to do otherwise, and determinism seems to rule out the ability to do otherwise. That's the standard problem. And Harry pointed out through a series of brilliant, maddening examples that free will just doesn't require the ability to do otherwise. I won't try to give you those examples. They're called Frankfurt cases. They're a little far out, but they nail the point to almost everyone's satisfaction. And so he shifted the focus of this discussion of free will and moral responsibility away from some abstruse questions in metaphysics to topics more squarely in moral philosophy, which was Harry's main interest. And then Harry went on to write a book on love, which includes a beautiful articulation of the point that although he loves his children, he knows they're nothing special. That's an important point. Loving involves seeing some value in the person you love, but it doesn't involve seeing them as more valuable than other people. And that's the puzzle that Harry wanted to understand. And he did this sort of thing from strength to strength. He had this fantastic mix of intellectual seriousness, a concern to avoid bullshit at all costs, to get the truth out and to understand things as they really are without illusions, and a kind of tolerance for obscurity, difficulty. When I was an assistant professor, when I was just starting out here, we had a reading group, Harry and I and one of our colleagues. We would get together once a week and read some allegedly important text that we'd never actually read that seemed to resist the kind of reading we'd been trained to do. So we read Simone Weil and Hannah Arendt and the Talmud, things like that. And for Harry, this wasn't just fun and games. He was alive to the possibility that there were important things to be learned from people who didn't write and think the way he did. And he spent quite a lot of time trying to bring himself face to face with the difficult truths that wouldn't show if you were just paging through the Journal of Philosophy.
Did you want to say anything about the academic? Because we're still sort of setting up Frankfurt's On Bullshit before we dig into all of its implications and what exactly bullshit is. I know, Gideon, you kind of wanted to say something about the academic context of On Bullshit and like what he was sort of reacting to.
So this has to do with the way I originally read On Bullshit. So Harry, before coming to Princeton, was a professor at Yale. He was a professor of philosophy at Yale in the 70s and 80s. And at the time, the Yale French department and the Yale English department were the beachheads in the United States for a wave of highly abstract, highly abstruse, philosophically inspired French literary theory that was taking over the humanities. And it had brought with it this flood of difficult jargon, deliberately opaque and obscure ways of writing. The whole premise of the thing was that if you think you're making sense, you're fooling yourself. So don't write in a way so as to fool yourself about that. And it had a massive impact in the humanities generally. Harry was witness to the emergence of this sort of thing firsthand. And when I originally read On Bullshit, I read it as in part a reaction to that. Not a reaction to political bullshit or the bullshit you find in advertising and PR and that sort of thing, but a reaction to academic bullshit. And interestingly, rereading it now, that doesn't actually show up all that much in the essay. But that's what I talked about with Harry when I first started talking about this sort of thing. And that was definitely my sense. So Harry hated bullshit, and we haven't yet said exactly what it is, in part because it shows a contempt for reason, which he found personally offensive. And so does academic bullshit of the kind that I was just describing. And it's quite interesting. In the afterword to this edition of On Bullshit, later remarks of Harry's are reprinted, a response to an essay of Jerry Cohen's about Harry's original essay. And Harry downplays that aspect of the story. He says, Cohen criticizes me for not saying enough about academic bullshit, not noticing the kind of nonsense produced by professors and its pernicious place in the academic world. And I know about that. That's bad. But how much damage can be done by these professors writing in ways that nobody can understand? That's got to be just a blip by comparison with the seriously pernicious bullshit that we find in public discourse. So my sense of what's going on in the book is I shifted slightly. I took it mainly as a polemic against academic nonsense, and now read it as mainly concerned with the sort of bullshit that is much more salient to us these days than it was to me then.
Well, what is bullshit, Jaime?
I feel like I'm the least qualified person in the room to talk about this. I'm not. I'm only an engineer. I actually really appreciate the definition that Harry Frankfurt gives of bullshit, because it's in a way very very operationalizable. As engineers like problems to be. You can actually write the truth table for statements that are true, statements that are deliberate lies, and then statements that are bullshit. And the key is that, perhaps the key distinction is understanding the difference between a lie and bullshit. Someone who is lying needs to have some intention to conceal the truth. They need to believe that they know the truth, and then they need to report the opposite thing or something else, because their goal is to get the other person, the person listening to what they're saying, to believe the wrong thing about the world, or what the speaker believes is not true about the world. So someone who is lying needs to engage with the truth, at least to the extent that they need to know what it is so that they can then hide it and obfuscate it. The bullshitter doesn't need to do any of that, because a bullshitter is not interested in the truth at all. Instead, the bullshitter is somebody who has some other agenda. They're about something else entirely, and they're going to say whatever it is that they need to say to get that agenda through. And so, in a way, it's great for them because they don't need to worry about what is true. They don't need to have a belief about the truth. They don't need to firmly believe that this is the way things are and going to say the opposite thing. Instead, they're just saying something that might be true, might not be true. None of my business. I'm just going to say that this is true. I'm going to portray myself as believing that this is true because it serves my purposes for something else. I think one of the lines I'm going to inaccurately paraphrase from Frankfurt's essay is the one defining characteristic of the bullshitter is that in some sense he misrepresents what he is up to. And that is, to me, this extremely important distinction that makes bullshit much more perverse than lying, because it exactly as you were saying, Gideon, it's just like it is a lack of respect. It's just that you don't even care if this thing is true or not, and yet you're saying it. And please correct my definition, because I'm sure I missed some important points.
Oh, that sounded pretty good.
Well, so now that we've got what bullshit is on the table, maybe we can turn to its impression beyond the field of philosophy. So Gideon has been talking about politics and bullshit. There's also a lot of stuff about AI and bullshit. So I've got some examples here, like journalists, when they cover AI, talk about bullshit quite a lot. Last year, Marina Adama, apologies if I mispronounced that, wrote a piece on AI slop for Reuters, which featured a discussion of on bullshit and cited Frankfurt's essay. And lots of journalists are doing this as well. PUP actually has a book, AI Snake Oil, by Arvind Narayanan and Sayash Kapoor from Princeton's Computer Science Department. And that book is also informing a project that Jaime is leading in the School of Engineering. So what are some of the connections between bullshit and these other domains, and especially AI? And then how does it connect? I'm interested in Jaime. How does it connect with your research, especially?
Well, I think the conversation around bullshit in AI is happening kind of at two levels. And I think that Arvind's book, which you're alluding to, is primarily engaged with the bullshit that humans feed to each other around AI or about AI. So claims that companies and individuals and, quite frankly, sometimes researchers will make about the capabilities of their AI systems and what we can do. And, oh, with this, you're going to be able to predict extremely accurately this or that thing about the world. And this is something that's been going on since before the latest, the latest generation of generative AI systems. And so that is something that I think is concerning, and that I think is very closely tied. It's definitely a human form of bullshit, and it is very closely tied to academic bullshit. It's the kind of hand-wavy statements that can be made between experts, or from experts to non-experts, or from someone who's trying to sell you something to everybody else. But then there's a more recent conversation, more recent for the most part, that has to do with the content that is being generated by some of these more modern AI systems. Nobody was particularly worried, nobody that I am aware of, was particularly worried that Google Maps was feeding them bullshit when they asked it how to get home. But now that we're all interacting with these extremely sophisticated chatbots like ChatGPT and Claude and Gemini and pick your favorite, there's this, I think, discomfort that a lot of us feel where whatever it is that you're asking about or whatever advice you're looking for, the answers that you get feel disingenuous in some form. And sometimes this is because they just feel like nonsense, and these models sometimes hallucinate, meaning they just make up stuff that is, it's a failure mode of these systems. They tell you about an article that somebody wrote that doesn't exist, or they allude to facts that are just off. But that, I would say, is not the most worrying thing. The thing that is increasingly happening, and that I think is increasingly worrying, even, I would say, even from the technical standpoint of people trying to work and understand these technologies, is these systems are, in some cases, actually being trained to say whatever they say in pursuit of a hidden agenda. That is, they're not saying what they're saying because it is true or because they have information that strongly supports that it's true. Sometimes that happens to be the case, but the ultimate motivation determining what they say is the signal that they are being trained to improve on and to optimize, which is user satisfaction. We are training these models, increasingly so, by the thumbs up, thumbs down signal that we click on responses, or by, some of you may have seen this, sometimes you get this, which of these two answers do you prefer? Answer A, answer B. Every time we're giving these systems this kind of information, that information is then being fed back into the systems to improve the systems. And this is well-intentioned. These systems are not being actively designed to bullshit to us, but what is actually happening is, well, we have a bit of a Goodhart's law effect, which is this rule that says that anytime that you're using some kind of proxy metric to improve some underlying thing that you care about, that metric ceases to be a useful metric at all the second you turn it into a target, because the more you actively just try to change the output of that metric, the less that thing correlates with what you actually cared about in the first place. In other words, the more these systems endeavor to convince us that they gave us a really great answer and should give them a thumbs up, the less useful that answer ultimately becomes. And the more likely it is that we're going to hear what we want to hear, even if that isn't actually what's going to be useful. So I think this is fascinating in a way, because I think it is accidentally revealing to us something about the origins of human bullshit. Why do people bullshit? Why, Frankfurt starts his essay saying, one of the most salient features of our culture is that there is so much bullshit. Everybody knows this, and we all contribute our share. But why? And I think that perhaps there's an accidental sliver of truth in this emergent bullshit that we're now seeing machines do, because they're not copying humans. A lot of people think these systems are just, of course they bullshit. They're just being trained on, words that people put out there online. And so because people bullshit, these systems bullshit. That's not it. These systems start to get really good at bullshitting on their own in pursuit of the goal of making us give them thumbs up and choose option A instead of option B.
Frankfurt speculates on why there's so much bullshit. And one of the things he says is, for some reason in contemporary culture, people are under a tremendous amount of pressure to talk about things they don't know anything about. And if pressured to do that, what you ought to do if you're not bullshitting is say, I don't know, never thought about that before. But until very recently, the LLMs would never say, I don't know. It's a real innovation that they're now being given that as an option. But when they don't have that as an option, and they're trying to say something that's going to keep the conversation going or please the user, they got to come up with something.
That's right.
And so the incentive structure just requires them to fill in the gaps with bullshit.
But I don't know that can explain where we actually find the hallucinations and the making things up with LLMs, because my understanding is that, a lawyer will be trying to write a brief and will use AI to write part of the brief, and the brief will make up court cases. But there's lots of court cases out there that are probably relevant to the case that, a researcher or someone just searching the database of what went into the LLM could find. So I think a lot of the hallucinations can't be explained by saying, oh, well, there isn't an answer sort of in what we fed it. It's something weirder about how LLMs work, I think, and how, because they're just they're trying to say like the kind of thing that a person would say in response.
So this is absolutely true. And I think that's why it's also important to distinguish here. I think hallucinations are, you could call them first generation. I would even say it's not actually bullshit. I don't think this is bullshit meaningfully in the way that Harry Frankfurt meant it. I think these are, let's call it first generation untruths or glitches with reality. I think these are cases where anthropomorphizing a little bit. I think these are cases where the model gets confused about reality. What happens is, you see this happen even in much simpler systems that you train with machine learning based on imitation. You can train a little toy car to drive around roughly following the path that was demonstrated, say, 10 or 100 times by a human driving the little car with an RC controller. And what's going to happen is at first the little robot car is sticking pretty well to the track and to the path that was demonstrated by the person. But over time, because it's not perfectly replicating it, it'll start drifting just a little bit to the right, say. And the problem then is that at some point, the more it drifts away from the areas where it had data on what to do, and on how to imitate the expert, it just gets into a situation that is different enough that it just has no idea really what the expert, what the human driver would have done. And so at that point, it's basically just spitballing. But then what you get there, whether you're steering the car, which eventually just like drifts off the track, or you look at what happens with the language model, where then it suddenly just goes off into complete nonsense. That's not really bullshit. It's true that it's not particularly engaged with the truth, but that's just there is no hidden agenda. This is the model trying and failing to imitate what a human would have said, exactly as you were saying. And there is that pressure to keep going, right? So sometimes it even gets into it. I don't know if you were playing around with language models early enough to have seen this, but sometimes they would go into loops. And they would say, and that's why it's very important that it's very important that it's very important that, and it'll just keep going. It's like genuinely like an AI broken record. But it is nonsense. But it's not bullshit in the sense that this newer generation of untruths which is now and really, if you look at what really made the jump from these early, funny language models that were fun toys but weren't really of much value commercially, to the first commercially deployed ChatGPT model, that difference is this second layer of training, where after you've taught your models to roughly copy what people would say or what people statistically are likely to continue a sentence with, you start giving them this reward signal. This is what we call reinforcement learning. You're learning to do more of the things that work out well and less of the things that don't work out well. And working out well, in this case, is just it's just measured in terms of whether at the end of whatever little paragraph I give the user, I get a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or I produce 2 candidate paragraphs and some of them get chosen over others. And that is, I think, it is only at that point that we can start to talk about, in some meaningful way, the model trying to do something. Because we are training in the optimization process that we use to drive the model. We are training them to pursue a goal, and that goal is a thumbs up. And it really becomes, because, as we were saying, the definition is so clear cut, it actually fits perfectly into the definition of what is now motivating these models to say what they're saying is not whether or not it's true. It's something else.
I mean, in addition to AI, of course, the other huge domain in which bullshit has application is politics. So I don't know if any of you wanted to say anything about the political sphere, of course. It's no fun if we don't get controversial.
I mean, when I said that 20 years ago, my colleague and I didn't really get what Harry was talking about, but now I do. Politics is definitely what I was thinking of. And just, am I getting this right? Did the President of the United States recently tweet or something that the World Series is rigged because he doesn't like the teams who made it to the World Series? Did I see that? And I just, that's an example of bullshit, right? That statement. But he's not interested in whether it's true, right? He likes to say stuff like that. And it's very destabilizing to live in a country where important people are acting that way. So Harry said the bullshitter is dangerous because he will get us to stop caring about the truth or something like that. And 20 years ago, I didn't really see how that would happen. And now, unfortunately, it's around us. I mean, not that we in this room don't care about the truth, but it's like we as a country don't care enough about the truth anymore.
I don't have a good way of saying how the present moment is different. Politicians have always been full of shit in a certain sense. That is, you can listen to a speech by Joe Biden, Obama, and they'll say many true things, but a lot of it is hot air. It's inevitably hot air, or a massive oversimplification, or the kind of thing that's designed to make them seem patriotic and enthusiastic about America and strong, whatever. They have that kind of goal to project a certain kind of image and to cause certain kinds of responses in their audience, and they have words that are calculated to do that, sometimes bland words, sometimes soaring rhetoric, which, whatever it's designed to do, isn't designed to convey the hard truth to the audience. Political oratory is rhetorical, and rhetoric, in a way, by its nature, is concerned with something besides the truth. But things have changed in ways that are instantly recognizable, but a little hard to put your finger on.
Rhetoric is not always bullshit. Certainly oversimplifying. Simplifying isn't the same as bullshit, because there's still some respect for the truth that may well be there. And when we teach when we teach middle school science, we simplify, and we don't tell them the truth about science, biology, and chemistry, really, but it's not with no regard to the truth, right? This no regard to the truth is kind of a strong thing. And, back for 20 years ago, there had already been a long time of lying about climate change from our politicians, but I think it was lying. It wasn't bullshit. I don't know if our president is a one-off, but there's something really different about what he's doing, I think.
Something that perhaps is worth pointing out is I think there's a sense, of course, we have a perspective about what is happening in the US because, well, it's where we live. But if you zoom out a little bit, it's easy to see that these are patterns that are happening internationally. There's many countries and many parts of the world where rhetoric is winning the battle against truth, and where there seems to be some kind of a race to the bottom in terms of what politicians and leaders and public figures will say to get ahead in the election race or in popularity and so on. And I keep worrying that in some part this is a little bit predictable given the pressures that we are, the rules under which we're setting up the game with the internet and social media and this increased interconnectedness that make it so that saying the thing that's going to get you, like you can say something that's going to go viral and you'll get immediate popularity, and truly one viral, 30-second snippet of a thing you said can get you to win an election. This is something that is much more true today than it was perhaps 20 or 30 years ago. And I do worry that in a sense, this can be accelerating these dynamics, creating this sort of very, very strong pressure to, forget about truth, forget about whether what I'm saying is useful to the person I'm saying it to. There's only one way to stay in the game, and that is to optimize what we say, to treat our speech acts as a critical part of our strategy. You're playing a game of chess with every move, and unfortunately, the way we've set up the game, winning means, winning the next election, winning the next midterm election. None of these things require you to think about what's going to happen 30 years from now. And so populism and rhetoric and bullshit, I think they are increasingly a part of public life in in much the same way that they're increasingly a part of the technology we're building.
Look, what you just said prompted the thought that I hadn't had before. So we want to explain why there's so much bullshit and why it has the character that it has. And we focused so far on the incentives for the producers of the bullshit. Why are they doing what they're doing? But as certain aspects of the internet social media world suggest, focus on influencer culture, for example. That only works because there's an appetite for bullshit.
Yes.
Right? So the reason there's an incentive to produce so much of it is because that's what the people want. And that's, in a way, even more mystifying than the original puzzle. People spend hours, 8 hours, 10 hours a day, scrolling for another hit of bullshit. And, I get to say that I'm mystified by that. I don't do that. I do a version of that even myself. When I'm looking to be soothed by the internet, I don't want something that's going to challenge my worldview. I want something that's going to make me feel at home in the world, or make me feel, to give me the sort of, the dopamine hit that comes from recognizing a bit of myself in the world. Who knows exactly what it is? But multiply that by the 4 billion people who are online constantly, and you get this vast market for soothing, reinforcing, empowering, distracting bullshit. And that's got to be part of why there's so much of it. But why is there the appetite?
To me, that's part of the terrifying thing, which is when we engage in exactly this dopamine soothing. We don't do that expecting that we are contributing, that this is being taken into account to determine how the world is going to be going forward. We definitely don't want this to be what politicians or movie makers and writers and journalists and technology will be taking as the reference for what they should do. But unfortunately, exactly as you said, that's what's driving a huge part of the market. So, yes, if that is what works, it is no coincidence that the apps we have on our phones are increasingly being built in such a way that it makes it easier and easier to doom scroll, until you just fall asleep out of sheer exhaustion, or you'll just continue watching. I feel maybe this is just a subjective impression, but I feel like I have fewer and fewer seconds to turn off the TV at the end of an episode on my whatever online platform before the next episode. It's almost like it's at some point it's going to be mid-sentence of the last character in the scene. It's like, okay, next episode now.
Well, we've got about 1 minute left. So within that minute, let's end on something that's a little bit more hopeful, something like a call to action. What can we do to combat the crisis of bullshit? What can we do in our personal lives? What do we do to rid ourselves of bullshit? Any parting words?
I mean, I want the news media to behave a little differently. Part of what I think was so hard for the news media when Trump started campaigning back before his first presidency was that he was clearly doing something different from other politicians. And I think the news media didn't know how to respond, so they didn't treat him like he was trying to say true things. And so they didn't necessarily point out all the things that weren't true because he was clearly not doing that. And I think that was probably not the right thing. But I want the news media to keep being serious, even as people in power aren't. But I don't really know if that's the right way to reach the voters who have gotten us into this situation.
So I don't know how scalable this is, but I think of this as something I can tell myself and also something I can tell my students. You need to be reminded That just as there's a dopamine hit associated with reassuring bullshit, there is another kind of dopamine hit associated with serious, reasoned discourse aimed at the truth. Scholarship gives great pleasure. Philosophy gives great pleasure. Serious journalism, serious history give great pleasure. And they give pleasure in part because they're serious. And to be exposed to enough of that to know that it's a real source of value, a real source of satisfaction, that you don't need the bullshit in order to get through the day, is hugely valuable.
I absolutely agree with Gideon. I think that my at least hopeful thought to end with is that we can individually make our day-to-day choices as though they matter, as though they will actually be part of what will shape how our lives will be and how, collectively our society, our systems will be built. If there's no other way to engage, to get that deeper satisfaction and deeper engagement with the world and with each other and with reality than to do it every day. And based on the way that these pressures are being built, and based on how quickly people and institutions and technology are responding to what we are doing and what we are choosing on a day-to-day, I really think that we have no choice. But the good news, I think, is that it is what we will. It is actually better for us. Like it's a reasonable ask you to make your day-to-day choices in a way that you feel really aligns with the things that we care about. And if we do that, I think that maybe we'll manage to change the incentives.
Well, we are going to turn to Q&A, but before we do that, let's give our panelists a round of applause. Yeah.
Just raise your hand, please, if you have a question.
Thanks very much to the panelists. Very interesting reflection and a reminder of Harry's wonderful spirit, and in particular that very interesting work. I was struck, though, about that very succinct and good definition of what Harry said about bullshit. That really it's this disregard for the truth, and yet it's striking, I think, that in the political case, in particular, our fearless president uses the notion of truth a lot in what he says. He's always talking about fake news and what's the truth and what isn't. And so it sort of feels like it's raising the quality of bullshit to a whole new level. Like, I don't care about the truth, but I know that this is a powerful word or concept to throw around in this way. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that. Thanks.
It's right that Trump says things are fake news, but in a way, it's a way of disarming that charge, right? Like, so he says it, he says it incorrectly, and then other charges don't stick as well. I think it's sort of brilliant. I don't think that, so Harry's notion of bullshit, it's not that the bullshitter is up front. So it's supposed to be disguised, right? I mean, it's supposed to be that one represents oneself as talking seriously, but in fact has no regard for the truth. And so it is a funny thing about Trump that people can kind of tell that he's not quite doing that. I'm obsessed with this thing that supporters of Trump used to say, and I'm sure still say, which is that they would say you should take him seriously, but not literally. Like, I'm so obsessed with that. What do they mean? and what is going on. Just take him seriously, but not literally. There's a story he's telling about himself and our country that he's really telling that is deeply moving to people, and he's telling it by saying all these ridiculous things. But there's something that's coming through that people are really drawn to.
I'll say that part of what makes the bullshitter much more dangerous than the liar is that you can disarm a liar with the truth. You can just present the truth, and then, whoops, the liar is, sort of, you caught them on the lie. But because the bullshitter didn't really care about the truth in the first place, they aren't disarmed. They can essentially just wave away the truth and say, like, that's not, I don't think that's true. And truly, I think that one of the things that you see in politicians who make bullshit one of their main strategies is they're very quick to delegitimize the truth or sources of serious sources or institutions that make efforts to report the truth. It's kind of the first thing you want to do, right? You want to say, like, hey, by the way, this, nah, because I don't care about it, and these people are going to be pestering me with what is and what isn't true. That's not what I'm about. So first thing I'm going to try to do is get as many people as possible on the same page. That this is like, we don't need to listen to all these people.
I think I also want to say there is a bit of a paradox in both seeing that someone is bullshitting and like taking seriously what they're saying. And what I want to say is, like, we're living inside that paradox. Like, that is how people are responding to Trump. They both say don't take him literally, and then they genuinely believe things that he says to them that are ludicrous. And so I just want to say that we're living inside that paradox.
Okay, I think we're going to take a live stream question.
We have quite a few people listening online, and mostly it's just been praise for you, so thank you very much. A question from Madison Spencer. How is the world of education addressing this as far as how children, young adults, develop the skills set required to think critically, clearly, and honestly?
I know it's on their minds. So my wife is a middle school principal, and they spend a lot of time among the staff and working with their students, asking themselves how to arm their students against the modern world. And there's no magic bullet for this. It's always been the thought that you would teach kids media literacy and critical thinking. So you would tell them how to distinguish a reliable source from an unreliable source. That was easy enough when you could list a small number of reliable sources like the New York Times and say, go there first. That's how you find out. No one defaults. I shouldn't say no one. There is no single set of authoritative sources to which everyone defaults. Everyone has their own idea of where the authoritative, reliable sources are and where they aren't. And given that that's where people start, I think it's a real conundrum how you teach critical skills to people who are getting all of their information from these utterly polluted sources.
Yeah, I think it's hard to do. I just want to allude to something you said earlier, which I think can and should be taught from as early an age as possible, and that is the joy and the satisfaction in really engaging with something, which is, I think, different from the default way in which, for practical reasons, we often end up setting up our academic curriculum, and that default tends to be more about, like, well, you've got to learn these things and you've got to say them back to me at the exam at the end of the term, and then students are essentially perhaps learning their little form of bullshit, which is, I don't need to know or understand these things in depth. I just need to seem to know them enough to, get through the exam. But there are cases, right? I think we all remember some teacher we had who really got us to love the thrill of diving into something and really understanding it and really learning it. And I think that's a high bar. It's hard to ask every teacher at every school to try to get that out of their students, but I think that is the only way. We want to teach critical thinking. Yes, we do, but critical thinking can be a lot of fun. You can have a lot of fun, ripping a paper apart, and pointing out all the ways in which it's bullshit and all the ways in which it's wrong. But you're not going to get to that easily if you're just focused on, like, these are the deliverables. This is what you have to prove to me that you know. We're perhaps encouraging the bullshit more than we are, helping kids really deeply engage.
Hi, thank you for the wonderful discussion, and thank you also for the idea of making my wedding a philosophy seminar. I think I'll go with that. If bullshit is such an effective political strategy, I'm wondering, and I guess it's a bit of a two-parter, why have we not seen it before, or have we maybe seen it before? And I guess what were the lessons we drew from that time? Thanks.
Well, we've definitely seen it before. So state-sponsored propaganda of the sort that has been the modus operandi of oppressive regimes, since the 19th century, if not before, definitely in the 20th century, that's a form of bullshit. The office of propaganda, in Berlin or in Moscow, sits around producing representations of the world with no concern whatsoever for the truth of the material they're representing. So that's not new. That's an old story. What's new is the decentralized, diffuse economy of bullshit that we're seeing now that we probably haven't seen before, in part because, until pretty recently, to produce a representation that people are going to consume was expensive, and only a small number of people had access to the printing press. Now everyone has access to the printing press, so there are more bullshitters who can be heard.
It's interesting to think about how the greatest upticks in production of bullshit throughout human history seem to have been tied to increases in our ability to easily communicate with one another. The first, sort of widespread use of propaganda came with the printed press. I think maybe the second thing most printed after the Bible in Gutenberg's workshops were propaganda leaflets for various political, but in particular at that time, sort of like to support and to drive the Protestant Reformation, right? So, and now we have the internet, and kind of like almost the first thing that happens is we start putting out all sorts of propaganda and fake news, and it's maybe because it's so deeply ingrained in the human nature to do everything strategically. I think that in part it's just like, oh, are you telling me that I can communicate better? How can I turn that to my advantage?
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you so much for this wonderful evening. My question is, if we look back in history, just the example you used right now of the press, printing press, and the resultant increase in bullshit, let's say, that were now shareable. If you fast forward to today, are there lessons we learned how we survived that, increase in bullshit that happened for the introduction of a new technology? Any thoughts on that would be great.
I'm not a historian, but my hunch is that there's something very different about the present moment. So as long as the printing press or whatever it is was expensive and not widely available. You could have gatekeepers. You could have a relatively small number of people whose job it was to police the representations that were made available to the world. And if you gave them the right incentives, and that's not easy to do, but if you gave some of them the right incentives, you could have identifiable authoritative sources that would be some kind of hedge against the junk that was produced elsewhere. In the current regime where the printing press, as it were, is cheap, you can't have gatekeepers, or it's much, much harder to have gatekeepers who police the information that's what, and that's what scholarly presses are for, that's what good newspapers are for, and they still do have some sway. But less and less now that everyone can have a blog, everyone can have an online journal, everyone can call himself a journalist. Given that fact about the economics of communication, I don't know what you do now to recover the structures that have done some good in the past, to see to it that there were reliable channels of information.
What I would say is that the one thing that corrects bullshit and misinformation over time is reality. And it is people's ability to observe reality and contrast that with whatever they read or they heard through whatever form. And over time, gradually, what has happened historically is unreliable narrators have more or less been filtered out and called out on being unreliable when reality proves them so. What is very different now is that we have such an acceleration in the rate at which we can share the information that, like fact checking, you could see this in the, in the elections and the debates sort of coming up to the most recent couple of elections. Fact checkers are just overwhelmed. The news cycle is overwhelmed because it's a bombardment. It never ends. So you cannot, the attention span, which is also part of what's happening to us, I think, with the constant stimulus of the internet, we're growing shorter and shorter attention spans. And so bullshit thrives in that ecosystem because it never gets called out, because by the time we would have realized that this thing was not true, was not reliable, it was just BS, the next thing has hit us. And so we are not, I think it is driving this thing that Harry predicted years ago, which is that bullshitters can ultimately get us to care less about what is true. I wish I had an answer to how to fix this. I think that the only hope is we need to keep a grasp on reality. We need to still believe that some things are true. And we need to hold on to them, to withstand the tempest of bullshit that unfortunately seems to be raging. I don't know if it's going to die out anytime soon.
All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap up here, but thank you again to our fantastic panelists, our fantastic moderator. Books are for sale in the back of the room for those on site. Please do stop by and purchase a copy if you're so inclined. And if you're watching live stream, you can buy the book at your favorite local independent bookstore. So thank you again to everyone for coming out tonight, and thanks to you all for a fantastic discussion.